The air in Terminal 7 smelled like burnt circuitry and old meat, and Eve Calloway had been breathing it for 4 days before she understood that the smell swung coming from the walls. Her sister Mara had called it home, had called it opportunity, had sent Eve a single voice message 6 weeks before she stopped answering. The recording clipped with static, Mara's voice doing that thing it did when she was trying to sound casual and failing, saying the neurovast compound was different from what she'd expected, that the work was different, that everything was a little different, and then a long silence before she laughed and said she'd explain when Eve visited. Come soon, Eve had come. She'd found the room empty, and Mara dead on the floor with her eyes wide open, pupils blown to the size of coins, a faint smile on her lips that didn't look like peace. It looked like something else entirely. The Kerath had built Terminal 7 30 years after the Accord. That was the official story. A joint venture, a cultural exchange, a monument to cooperation between humanity and the oldest spacefaring species in the 7th spiral arm. The real story, the one you could piece together from the graffiti on the sublevel walls, and the faces of the people who worked the lower floors, was something quieter and more total. The Kerath didn't build prisons. They built ecosystems. Systems designed so elegantly that the animals inside them forgot there were walls. The compound rose 600 meters above the industrial flatlands of what used to be central Ohio. From the outside, it looked like a cathedral crossed with a processing plant. All vertical glass and organic curves, bioluminescent strips running in complex patterns up the exterior, like the nervous system of something immense. From the inside, it looked like every city you'd ever wanted to live in, smaller and brighter, and just slightly wrong in ways you couldn't immediately name. The ceilings were too high, the corridors too smooth, the light sources hidden so completely that shadows fell from so discernible direction. Eve had secured a position on sublevel 3 within 2 days of arriving. Neurovast's human-facing operations hired readily. The Kerath preferred human intermediaries for their ground-level work, found direct contact with large groups of humans inefficient, something about the noise humans generated at a sub-auditory level that disrupted Kerath concentration. So humans ran the clubs, the entertainment tiers, the residential blocks. Humans signed the contracts in human languages and paid other humans in human currency. The fact that all of it flowed upward, through channels that humans couldn't track, and into purposes they couldn't quite define, was, officially, not something the human-facing operations were designed to illuminate. The club was called Twilight. It occupied 3 floors of sublevel 3, and ran 22 hours out of every 24. And the humans who worked it moved through it with the specific careful fluency of people who had learned not to ask about certain doors. Eve learned the layout in a day. She had always been good at spaces. Her father had called it her talent for reading rooms, the way she could walk into an unfamiliar building, and within minutes know where every exit was, where the power was routed, which walls were load-bearing, and which were decoration. She'd used it doing security assessments back in Kansas, walking through substations and refineries, and making notes about vulnerabilities. She used it now walking through Twilight, memorizing flow patterns, noting where the human staff clustered and where they avoided. Watching the low-profile surveillance nodes, she wasn't supposed to recognize as surveillance nodes. She found Mara's locker on day 2, found the folded paper inside it, covered in her sister's cramped handwriting. The letters, small and tight like Mara, had been trying to compress something large into a small space. It wasn't exactly a message. It read more like someone thinking out loud, following a thread. Words, sequencing, resonance mapping. The signal lives in the response. They don't understand what they're taking. It isn't the pleasure. It's the texture of us under the pleasure. The thing underneath. They've been cataloging the thing underneath. Eve read it 3 times standing in the locker room with the sounds of the club filtering through the walls, the low pulse of the music, the particular modulated frequencies the Kerath's entertainment architects used, engineered to produce relaxation and receptivity in the human nervous system, designed to make you feel like you were exactly where you wanted to be. She put the paper in her pocket and went back to work. The man who ran the 4th floor operations was called Felix, and he was one of those humans who had been inside the compound so long he had started to move like the architecture. Too smooth, too considered, nothing wasted. He wore loose clothes in colors that didn't quite appear on the standard spectrum, sourced, from somewhere up the supply chain. And he had the eyes of someone who had decided a long time ago to find the arrangement of the world entirely acceptable. He told Eve she had potential. "There's a production," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, his gaze landing slightly to the side of her face in a way the Kerath had. Neurovast produces documentation of human experience, experiential recordings, for research purposes. What kind of research? The kind that compensates generously, she agreed. She needed access to the upper levels. She needed to understand what Mara had understood before she died. The production set was on sublevel 1, access through a corridor that required 2 separate clearances and a biometric confirmation. It looked nothing like what Eve had expected, not slick or clinical, but sprawling and half-assembled, like a place that was built the way dreams are built, by accumulation rather than plan. Props, from different contexts, stacked against walls. Lighting rigs aimed at angles that seemed to have nothing to do with the staging. Human technicians moving around the edges of things with the focused silence of people concentrating on a task they didn't fully understand. The scenario itself was surreal in a way that felt specifically engineered. A farm setting, constructed from salvaged materials that smelled faintly of real earth. Scarecrow figures in postures of frozen collapse. 2 figures in masks shaped like corvid skulls, moving to music that came from everywhere and nowhere, a looping industrial pulse that said, "Freedom from the flesh, freedom from the flesh," on a vocal sample that repeated until the words stopped sounding like words. Eve stood in the middle of it and felt the frequency doing something to the back of her skull. She was supposed to feel receptive. She was supposed to open. She'd read enough of Mara's notes by then to understand the mechanism. The music wasn't entertainment. It was a key, and the recordings weren't documentation. They were extractions. The Kerath had spent 20 years studying human emotion at the clinical level. The neurochemical signatures, the brainwave patterns, the small electric ghost that moved through human tissue when a person felt something real. They were good at cataloging it. But cataloging was not the same as understanding, and the Kerath were meticulous enough to know the difference. What they were after was something they'd found in the very first recordings and hadn't been able to isolate since. Some texture in the human stress response. Something that appeared in the space between terror and refusal, in the moment when a human being was pushed to an edge and chose not to go over it. The Kerath called it by a designation Eve had found in the operational documents she'd accessed on the 3rd day. A term that translated approximately as the sustaining anomaly, the thing that shouldn't work mathematically. The thing that kept firing when every model said it should have stopped. They had 63 recordings of it. They had not been able to reproduce it under controlled conditions. Because every time they engineered the circumstances that had produced it, humans produced a slightly different version. Adapted, mutated, crossed with some new variable the models hadn't accounted for. The Kerath were meticulous and patient and genuinely baffled. They kept refining the extraction process. The humans who went through the extraction process, if they were unlucky, went through it too many times, and the thing the Kerath didn't understand about, the sustaining anomaly, was that it was expensive. It cost something to produce. It drew on a reserve that had limits. Mara had understood this. Mara had followed the thread all the way to the end. Eve stood in the farm set with the frequency pressing against her brainstem and thought about her sister's handwriting, small and compressed, trying to fit something large in a small space. She thought about the way Mara had laughed at the end of the voice message, the laugh that meant she was scared, but had decided to be brave anyway. She thought about a specific afternoon when they were children, the 2 of them crouched in the tall grass behind their father's property, watching a thunderstorm come in across the flat land, the lightning doing its accounting at the edge of the world. Mara counting the seconds between flash and sound with her finger held up, explaining to Eve exactly how to tell how far away danger was. She felt something in her chest that she recognized as the thing the Kerath had been trying to record. She let it come, and then she let it turn. The override took 11 minutes. She had the technical details from the documents, and the spatial understanding from 4 days of walking the compound, and the specific knowledge of which subsystems ran, on which power conduits from the schematic she had pulled from the maintenance terminal on sublevel 2. She had the tools, not weapons, because weapons would have triggered every biometric alert in the building. but a portable signal disruptor she had built over 3 days from components available in the facility's repair shop, and a loop of Kerath resonance code she had extracted from the production system's own hardware. The key turned back on the lock. The Kerath communication architecture operated on a consensus model. No single node controlled the system. Decisions propagated through the network by resonance, each node confirming and amplifying the signal from every other node. It was elegant and nearly unbreakable, because attacking any single point was meaningless. The whole was the thing. Eve didn't attack a single point. She introduced an anomaly. The disruptor broadcast a signal she'd spent 2 nights calibrating. Something that read to the Kerath network as consensus, as confirmation, as the recognizable pattern of a decision already made. The decision it described, propagating through the network in the Kerath's own syntax, was a full facility evacuation order, originating from the highest clearance tier, validated by the resonance signatures of 3 senior nodes, whose access codes she had lifted from the production system's own logs. It took 4 minutes to propagate completely. It took another 7 minutes for the compound to realize something was wrong, by which point Eve had the archival server isolated and the extraction equipment running a different kind of documentation. 63 recordings copied, operational data copied, the full catalog of what the Kerath had taken from 63 human beings, who had each contributed something that cost them something real. Felix found her in the server room. He stood in the doorway with his too smooth posture and his off-spectrum clothes and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be disappointed and landing somewhere closer to frightened. "You understand what you're doing," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm starting to," Eve said without looking up from the terminal. "They'll reconstruct the system. They'll trace the anomaly. Everything you think you're accomplishing here." "I know." She pulled the drive, held it in her palm. It was the size of her thumb. It felt heavier than it should have. "That's why I'm not just taking the recordings." She showed him what else she'd found in the operational files. The methodology documents. The Kerath's own analyses of the sustaining anomaly, 40 years of meticulous research into the thing that kept firing when every model said it should have stopped. Not just the recordings of it. The Kerath's best current theory of why it existed. Felix looked at the files for a long time. "That's their primary research output," he said quietly. "That's 40 years of xenobiological analysis of human neurological function. That's the most complete study of the human stress response ever compiled." "Yeah," Eve said. "And we didn't know we were in it." She walked past him toward the corridor. The evacuation signal was still propagating through the lower levels. She could hear the specific harmonic the Kerath broadcast systems used when they were executing a high-priority instruction. A sound like the inside of a seashell amplified and given teeth. Around it, underneath it, she could hear something else. The movement of humans through the compound's corridors. The sounds of people who had been working in a system so elegant they had forgotten there were walls, and were now, for reasons they didn't yet understand, moving toward the exits. She thought about thunderstorms. She thought about counting seconds between flash and sound. The Kerath pursuit caught up with her in the transit hub at level 2. 4 of them moving in the particular coordinated way that made watching them feel like watching a single organism with 4 expressions. They were tall, the Kerath, all of 2.5 meters, with the elongated bilateral symmetry of something that had evolved in very low gravity and never entirely adapted to standard atmospheres. Their faces, what human perception processed as faces, registered emotions in color shifts rather than movement, and all 4 of them were currently doing something in the deep violet range that Eve's limited xenobiological education suggested was associated with controlled urgency. They stopped in a formation that blocked the corridor efficiently, and one of them, the one whose color shifts were running slightly ahead of the others, addressed her through the translation module it wore at its throat. "The anomaly in the network," it said. "We would like to understand its origin." "I know you would," Eve said. "The documentation you have removed is the property of Neurovast, Consolidated. It's a record of things that happened to human beings inside a facility that those human beings didn't have complete information about. I'm not sure that's how property works." The color in the Kerath's expression shifted, violet to something in the deep amber range, something that might have been recalibration. She'd read enough of their research documents by now to know that this was the thing that threw them. Not defiance. They had extensive records of defiance and could model it accurately. What threw them was the human tendency to argue from a framework so foundational that the argument itself was the action. The way humans treated their premises as weight-bearing walls, rather than positions to be defended. Our research, the Kerath said, has been conducted in accordance with the terms of the Accord. The Accord covered exchange of information and cultural access, Eve said. It doesn't actually specify the terms for non-consensual neurological extraction from human subjects, probably because no one thought they needed to write that down. Another shift. Deeper amber. The other three Kerath were running color patterns she didn't have reference for. The data is comprehensive, the first one said, and there was something in its translate tone that she had not heard in Kerath's speech before. A frequency that her body processed as uncertainty before her mind had named it. It represents the most complete analytical record of human. It paused, and the translation module produced a soft clicking that meant the original term had no good human equivalent. Of human, persisting function in the research corpus of any species in the seventh spiral arm. The implications of that record for xenobiological understanding of, I know what it implies, Eve said. You found something you couldn't explain, and you kept finding it, and you still can't explain it. 40 years and you still don't know why it works. The color in all four Kerath shifted simultaneously to something she had no reference for at all. No, the first one said quietly. We do not. Good, Eve said. She held up the drive. Neither do we really. But it's ours not to understand. She walked through them. She walked through them because she had run the calculation. And the calculation said they would not physically impede a human who was not presenting as a threat, because the Accord's operational guidelines defined physical contact with human citizens in a way that made obstruction legally complex, and because 40 years of research into the sustaining anomaly had not once produced a model that accurately predicted what a human being would do when they decided the situation was simply not going to go the way it was going. She walked through them, and they let her go. In the main atrium, 300 people were moving toward the transit exits. Dancers, technicians, production staff, maintenance workers. The small hidden population of people who had lived and worked inside the compound long enough to stop counting the days. Some of them were confused. Some of them were carrying things. A woman Eve had met briefly in the locker room was sitting on the floor against one of the organic curve walls, crying in a way that looked like relief rather than grief. Eve stopped beside her. She didn't say anything particularly useful. She sat down on the floor next to the woman and waited for a minute, the drive still in her hand, the data still warm from the server. After a moment, the woman looked at her and said, I don't even know why I'm crying. Yeah, Eve said. Sometimes that's how it works. Outside, the flatlands of Ohio were doing what they did in late autumn, going copper and brown under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue, the industrial lights of the distant township reflected in the cloud base. Everything flat and immense and aggressively real after days inside a compound, built to make you forget what real felt like. Eve sat on a concrete barrier at the edge of the transit hub and watched the compound's lights cycle through their evening sequence and thought about Mara's handwriting, the letters small and compressed. They don't understand what they're taking. She had understood it toward the end, had understood it and tried to stop it and had not quite managed to stop it in time. Eve had managed it. Not by being braver than Mara, or smarter than Mara, or more capable than Mara, by having one more day than Mara had, by being the person who came in from outside, who hadn't had the walls built up around her yet, who could still see them. She looked at the drive in her hand. 63 recordings, 40 years of analysis, the most comprehensive xenobiological study of human neurological function ever compiled. The Kerath's meticulous accounting of the thing that shouldn't work, mathematically, but did. The thing that kept firing when every model said it should have stopped. The Accord's review process was going to be a bureaucratic catastrophe. The legal arguments were going to run for years. The evading that Neurovast had been operating a non-consensual research program inside what was supposed to be a joint cultural facility was going to land like a stone dropped from a very great height, and the ripples were going to go in directions no one could fully predict. But the Kerath had been cataloging humanity for 40 years, and they still didn't understand what they'd found. And Eve thought that was probably fine. Some things you understood by living them rather than analyzing them. And that asymmetry, the thing the models couldn't capture, the variable that kept mutating away from every controlled condition, was not a flaw in the data. It was the data. She pulled out her comm and called the number she'd memorized from the regulatory filings of the independent monitoring body for Accord compliance. The number she'd memorized 3 days ago, in the same way she'd memorized exit routes and power conduits, and the location of every door she might need to go through fast. The line connected on the third ring. "This is Eve Calloway," she said. "I'm outside Duramus Terminal 7, and I have about 4,000 people who are going to need processing assistance. And I have a data package I'd like to formally submit for review under Article 7 of the Accord's Human Subject Protections. I also have a name. My sister's name is Mara Calloway, and I want it on record." She gave it. She waited. The compound behind her cycled through another sequence of lights, its bioluminescent exterior reading, like the nervous system of something vast and alien, which it was. In front of her, the flatlands ran out to the horizon in every direction, flat and copper, and absolutely indifferent to the significance of any particular moment, the sky pressing down on all of it with its usual editorial silence. Eve sat in the cold with the drive in her hand, and waited for what came next, the same way she'd been doing since she was 9 years old, crouching in tall grass, watching the lightning do its accounting at the edge of the world, counting the seconds between flash and sound to know exactly how close the danger was. She'd been counting for a long time. She didn't plan to stop.